From Chicago's CAN TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there, and welcome to the show. So it was a big day at a city council meeting yesterday, wasn't it? It's been described as historic, at least in part because a sitting governor addressed the distinguished body, but come on, let's be honest, it might have been an anomaly. It'll have zero historic significance, and in fact, while he was away from Springfield, did you know this? The legislature was passing a resolution essentially saying it would never go along with some of the most important aspects of his proposed budget. So much for Governor Rauner's visit to the city council. What did have a flavor of history, though, was the mayor of Chicago looking straight into the gallery and addressing a group of people who were tortured. Yes, that's the official word now, tortured by the Chicago Police Department. And here's what Mayor Emanuel had to say.
What happened here in this action today is that Chicago finally will confront its past and come to terms with it and recognize when something wrong was done and be able to be strong enough to say something was wrong. And to the aldermen that led the efforts, I want to also say to the victims and families, I want to thank you for your persistence. I want to thank you for never giving in, never giving up, and allowing the city to join you on that journey to come face to face with the past and be honest enough and strong enough to say when we are wrong and try to make right what we've done wrong. This stain cannot be removed from our history of our city, but it can be used as a lesson of what not to do and the responsibility that all of us have.
And the mayor very rightly and properly thanked the aldermen and the families who had worked on this problem for so many years. He didn't happen to mention Flint Taylor for gratitude, and we'll do that today here on this show. Over all these years, Flint Taylor has been working with the victims of John Burge and his so-called midnight crew. He probably never expected to be standing in the chamber and witness what he witnessed yesterday, but he's joining us now to join about how these reparations are going to be implemented, and we're glad to have you here again. We were here a couple weeks ago. Thanks for coming back.
My pleasure.
Steve Rhodes is also joining us. Steve Rhodes has been writing about this and so many other things for so many years in the Beachwood Reporter, and I'm glad to have Steve back on the show again, too. Thanks both for being here. Flint, you have something that you hadn't probably imagined you would have. Give us the quick outline of it. It's as much as $100,000 per survivor to start with.
Right, that's the financial compensation or the financial reparations, depending on how many men are eligible and qualify for the compensation. It'll be up to $100,000 in that area. But there's a lot of non-financial reparations that make it truly historic. Let's start with the educational part of it. There's going to be taught in the Chicago public schools in the 8th and 10th grade. There's going to be a curriculum to deal with police torture. That's something very unique. There's going to be a memorial here in the city to the survivors of police torture. There's going to be a center on the south side that's devoted not only to psychological counseling, because of course a lot of the men have suffered severe psychological damage, their families as well. There'll be an archive there, a historical archive. There'll be artwork and all of that. There will also, as you heard, there was an official apology as well. There'll also be free education at the city colleges for not only the men, the survivors, but their families. That is obviously very significant as well. So the entire package that was negotiated by a team of people from the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials, which I had the privilege of being one of the members of that team. This was negotiated over months, but it also was a product of a strong and unified multiracial and multi-generational movement that came together in the last year or year and a half to demand in various different ways that this be implemented. And one of the ways was going to aldermen and getting their commitment to the original ordinance. But another was demonstrations at City Hall, marches from the police station to City Hall, hearings. There was a hearing just a few weeks ago on it. All kinds of different activist activities that we haven't seen as much of until recently in the city.
Well, you say multi-generational.
Yes.
It would almost need to be multi-generational because it was so long ago. What were the, I mean, we now have legally defined dates for this, right? What was the period?
Well, if you start with the first person who was tortured, who was there yesterday, a man by the name of Lindsay Smith, who was 17 years old at the time. That was in August of 1972, only months after Burge became a detective. He'd come back from Vietnam, become a Chicago police officer, then became a detective. The next year he tortured another man who was there, Anthony Holmes. That's the first time we know about electric shock and the kind of suffocation with a bag, that kind of torture. Then you go all the way up to the present. So that's, 40 some odd years? We started to unravel the cover-up maybe 10 or 15 years after that. And we started to understand after that Daley's role in it as prosecutor and later as mayor. And then in the 90s, Burge was fired. Then we had the death penalty fight, which led to men who were tortured coming off of death row and being pardoned on the basis of innocence. Then, of course, we had the going to the UN, saying that Chicago was a place where torture should be prosecuted. And in fact, finally, the U.S. Attorney prosecuted Burge, convicted Burge, and that led to the reparations fight. So that's a thumbnail sketch of this 45-year struggle and a police scandal, torture scandal.
See what you're going to say? I'm sorry.
Oh,
I thought you were going to say something.
I was just wondering in terms of the time frame of the men tortured and people who may file claims. Does that not go up through 1991?
It does.
Is that correct?
That's right.
So as really, I mean, in some ways that's still fairly recent history, even though we start 40 years ago. Up through 1991, this was still going on.
Definitely, and that's the only reason.
20 years.
Yeah. The only reason it stopped was because the evidence came out in the Wilson trials, partly through someone who we termed Deep Badge, who was an anonymous police source who worked with Burge, who sent us information that this one torture, the infamous Andrew Wilson case, wasn't some isolated incident, but was part of a racist, systemic program by Burge and his people. And that then led to a reopening by the police department of an investigation, which led to Burge's firing.
There are so many people who have done heroic work here. I mean, there really are. But I'd have to say that the guy who I am most in awe of is this Deep Badge. I say guy. I assume it's a guy. Did you ever find out who he actually was?
No, he or she. I mean, that shows that we don't really even know the gender of the person. Was so fearful of the code of silence and what might happen from this serial torturer if he were discovered, that initially the letters that we got said, you can't tell anybody this. And at first we didn't. But then a year or two later, since his name wasn't in it, we felt compelled to make it public. But in that period of time, we had followed the leads that he had given us.
This is incredible. It really is.
It's a bit of a detective story, you know. That
it's like Watergate, only it's real. It's
well, that's
real.
why we called him Deep Badge. You know, back then, Deep Badge, you know, Deep Throat, all of that.
But this individual, though, just did he contact you more than once? Was it an ongoing kind of relationship?
There were 4 letters that we got over a period of 6 months, and the most significant letter came in March, at the very time that I was cross-examining Burge in the Wilson civil rights trial, and he led us to a guy who was in the county jail who had been electric shocked, a guy by the name of Melvin Jones. and who had told his story in court many years before, but everybody had ignored it.
Yeah.
And judges had ignored it. And that led us to others.
Did anyone else ever come forward? Because this wasn't just John Burge. You've mentioned the Midnight Crew, but a whole lot of people must have known, because it was such a systematic kind of thing. But did anyone else break that code of silence, or was it just this one individual?
There were several others. There was an individual who called me, told me some details, said he'd meet me at a bar at 11 a.m. over on Wells Street. And we went over there, and he didn't show up. And then I compared notes with an old reporter who's long gone now, but if I can think of his name now, he was at Channel 5, and Walters. And he had a similar experience with this guy. This guy had told him all this stuff, and he brought him in right here like he hooked him up, and then the guy was they're going to black his face out, like they do. And he was about to tell the Burge tale, and the guy freaked out, tore the microphone off, and ran out of the studio. So there's stories like that, and there were, so we were getting these, anonymous stories.
Well, you've told stories of Burge and his cronies just racing through the files everywhere, trying to find out who this was, who Big Badge was.
Yes.
They wanted him.
They wanted him, and there was another detective, a white detective named Frank Laverty, who exposed the entire secret street file system of the police department. And he happened to work in Area 2 at the time that Burge did. And a message was sent about Laverty, who was a whistleblower before we had that term, I think, even. One day we later learned from a black detective that Laverty was walking out of the room, where the detectives gather. And he had his back to the room, and Burge pulled out his gun and went bang, bang, to let everybody in the room know that's what they thought of Laverty. So, that message gets sent not only in the torture cases, but gets sent generally, the code of silence.
If I could, I'd like to get us back to the settlements, because when I saw the numbers and the settlements, I started having to bat back some cynicism, I have to tell you, because I'm thinking, isn't it like about $100 million that's already been spent in litigation to protect him? And in the last couple of weeks, we had you on the show just 3 weeks ago talking about 2 individual settlements with police killings of civilians. In both cases, $5 million was given to those individual families. I'm not disparaging that in any way, but by comparison, it would help me not be cynical enough to say that this is just a way for the city to buy peace on this and to close the book and walk away.
Well, you're entitled to your cynicism. We all have a certain amount of it that keeps us going. But let me say that with regard to the reparations, it really wasn't a settlement. There was no lawsuit possible for these men. That's number one. The city didn't have to give them a nickel. Their statute of limitations had run because of the cover-up of evidence. These men have never been exonerated, so they had no, this wasn't about them spending 20 years in jail or 25 years in jail. It wasn't about whether they were guilty or innocent. It was about whether they were tortured. And of course, $100,000 per man for being tortured, okay, I can agree with you. That how do you compensate someone for torture? But we felt that was, if not symbolic, but it would be significant to men's lives who are on the street and struggling. And the city, because of the budget, situation and the fact they didn't have to give a nickel, that was something, that was a real concession that we fought very hard for. It didn't come natural, just didn't come as the part of the agreement. We had to negotiate very hard to get any money out of them. And so our bottom line was $100,000 per person, and that's what we feel we basically accomplished. But the other things, the kind of holistic reparations, and using that term in the same way we fought to use the term torture back when everybody wanted to call it police brutality and abuse. We fought very hard and with consciously to use the word reparations when a lot of aldermen were saying, well, maybe that's not, maybe that's a little too strong a word. But we fought for that, and if you think about it, the non-financial aspects of it are very significant, and some of these men are not only very grateful for the fact that maybe this is enough money to get them, totally out of debt or until the next job, but they want psychological care. They want the truth of what happened to them taught. They want the possibility of their grandchildren or their children to go free to college, because a lot of them have kids who, are out there trying to make a life for themselves. So I think when you strip aside maybe the numbers, you see something that's really quite historic.
But what strikes me when you were describing that was the fact that you had to fight so hard right up to the end, just to get even $5.5 million, strikes me as being somewhat in contrast to the mayor's, sudden revelation that this is the right thing to do. I mean, maybe what it makes me even more cynical of is the mayor kind of taking this on as his own achievement. So was he responsible for the city fighting up to the end? I mean, how do you kind of assess his role in this?
I think the mayor wanted to send a message to the African American community that he did care. As you mentioned, the blue sweater approach.
Yes, on, right?
Right. That was a very conscious part of the movement here. Was the primary campaign. Not only getting the aldermen committed, but getting the candidates committed back at the primary time, and continuously raising the fact that Emanuel hadn't publicly taken a position. He never took a position against it, never took a position for it. But
unlike the previous mayor.
Yes. Well,
but if he had been for it, it would have passed the week it was introduced,
well,
right? Because we know that's how it works.
Yeah, that's why ultimately, let's not kid ourselves. We had 29 aldermen signed on to the original ordinance, but if Emanuel said no thank you to it, I think we would have had less than 29 people voting for it. There would have been, so we understood that politics.
So just we'll drop this, but a quick question about the implementation. There's enough money to pay $100,000 to 55 victims who you've identified. But as I understand it from what I've seen in the paper today, and I don't know if this is true, I hope you can correct this, there might be other victims who will be able to legally define themselves to come into that class.
Right.
We don't know who they are. There are probably lawyers right now, shyster lawyers, saying, wow, I can get my friend in there. I don't know. But if that happens, then the $100,000 begins to come down every time somebody's added to the class, right?
Well, that's true.
And I saw Wallace Gator Bradley yesterday. His number is 80 or something. He thinks there is 80, not 55.
Yeah, we don't know for sure. We did concede that the deceased people, their families would not get money, but they would get the non-financial benefits. We felt it was more important for the living men to get more rather than the deceased people. So yeah, we don't know what the pool is. It's anywhere from, could be 50, could be 70. We have a range we think it's going to fit in. We think it's going to fit in somewhere between 50 and 65 people. When 20 people or so have already gotten large multi-million-dollar settlements because they were exonerated. But
it was for their exoneration.
Right, and they were tortured and as well as wrongfully convicted. And then another 20 or so are deceased. So, we know that those people, unfortunately, their families will not collect money. So we have a pretty good feel for the group.
If I could, I want to try to correct the mistake we made. That wasn't a mistake, but the situation we had the last time you were here where we said we wanted to talk about Holman Square, and we ended up having the last 3 minutes of the show, and we have about 10, so we might be able to do something worthwhile. The question is that there are obviously serious allegations today that have been raised in the media, in some media, about the interrogation process the Chicago Police Department is using at Holman Square. And there is a temptation to try to draw some parallel here. I'm not sure that it's fair to do that, but we've, at least in most minds, settled this one. We've put this one to rest and said that yes, there was indeed let's call it inappropriate interrogation, torture. But there might be inappropriate interrogation going on right now as we speak in Chicago, under this mayor's watch, under this police superintendent's watch. But we don't really know. We just have suspicions. So is this 1974 all over again? Are we kind of in the same place?
Oh, I don't know if we're in the same place in the sense that what's going on at Homan, we don't have people being having their genitals shocked with electrodes. We have other kinds of, I think, abusive interrogation going on. To me, the similarity is in the not just lack of local media response, but the pushback by local media, as if this is something so beyond the bounds of what a Chicago Police Department would ever do. Right here, when we're just finally coming to grips in some sort of way on John Burge. I don't understand. And one of the lessons that from the institutional point of view of different institutions learning their lessons from Burge, for the media, it was the idea that, boy, the media ignored John Conroy's reporting in the Reader on this for about a decade. And much of the media still never really dipped into Burge. I mean, the Tribune then did their death penalty series and so on. But has the media not learned any lessons? I don't know why Homan Square would seem to be so incredible to them, especially with the reporting that The Guardian does, which seems to me to be nailed down solid. And they've now, I don't know if people realize, but The Guardian has now done 16, 17, 18 stories.
Well, I have to tell you,
So
I didn't realize that until you brought that up. And it's like, oh my God.
it's a huge package they've
I was talking to
done,
somebody
right.
and saying, well, I think they've done 2 stories on it. And then, no, Steve Rhodes
And
says it's,
right, and they found between them and a couple other outlets like The Intercept, for example, we've got more than a dozen named victims from Homan. We've got at least 7 or 8 named lawyers who have had problems reaching their clients there. And yet the response by the media locally has been, the response is quite curious. At first it was like, well, that's not going, there's no way that could be going on. You know, because the Guardian did this story and we would have known about it because we're the Chicago media. Then it changed to, well, yeah, it's going on everywhere. Well, it can't be both. And you have this mindset in the media. Well, when you get beat it's legendary in newsrooms, you may recall. You get beat on a story and your first instinct is, well, that's not a story. And I think that's not a story. Or then instead of being, oh my God, what a great story, let's all jump in on it. It's let's see what we can do to knock this story down. And to me, that's the parallel. I mean, there are parallels in terms of abusive police. Flint, you can speak to that better about the police activity and whether it's a fair comparison or not. But that's kind of the thing that catches my attention the most.
Well, that is the question that I've most wanted to ask you, and you're the one in Chicago more than anyone who I'd like to ask that question to. It seems unfair to ask the question, but do you see the possibility that there might be parallels?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, thanks.
I do. I did write a piece about it when I looked at the UN's CAT definition of torture and abuse and interrogation, and I looked at some of the extreme cases that were reported by The Guardian, and since then, I've had a few people come to me with similar stories, other stories where the physical abuse to get information or to get a confession is similar, maybe not as extreme as you pointed out as electric shocking, but chaining to walls, sensory deprivation, physical brutality to the genitals, one case holding a knife to somebody's throat. And I think that they're going to be, and people are intimidated to come forward, right? The whole point to what's going on here is to intimidate into becoming informants, intimidate into getting information. So you don't want to come forward, but people are starting to come forward. So I thought it was, and think it's perhaps the tip of the iceberg. And when the city of Chicago starts to deny and to cover up, you get those same similarities that you see with Burge. So I'm certainly, at the very least, would take a wait and see attitude. Because as I said, since some of those articles came out, we have had reports of other cases, and I'm sure other people have as well.
So specifically, to the extent that we can have specificity, our source pretty much on this entire conversation is reporting in The Guardian, let's face it, right? I mean, you say there are a few others who may have found a couple of people here and there, but it's always difficult when your knowledge base traces back to one thread, credible though that thread may be. What are the offenses? The offenses appear to be the withholding of constitutional rights. Is that fair? I mean, it's like you can't see your lawyer, we're going to keep you for 24 hours without a warrant, all extremely serious and unconstitutional things. But we have not yet seen, this is dangerous water to tread on. I don't know. We haven't yet seen accounts that would talk too much about there being physical abuse of what we've seen before.
Well, there's enough accounts of that that we need to take that seriously. When you combine not having a lawyer, being secreted for 24 hours, with whether it's being putting a knife to someone's throat or kicking them in the testicles, or keeping them without water or bathroom privileges, chained to a wall in a dark room. I mean, all of that comes. Those are constitutional violations.
Yeah.
And that and the accounts of that seem to be the most consistent are being chained to that wall and not being allowed food or not being able to go to the bathroom and not knowing what you're being held for and for how long. But also these things, as I understand it, fall under what folks now call touchless torture, some of which were techniques developed in, we think of the the CIA black sites overseas, and we think of the kind of torture that we think happened at Abu Ghraib and that sort of thing. But a lot of what was developed over there and is used here are these techniques or solitary confinement for a long period of time, that techniques that don't leave marks. That's what can help make them effective, but which can have a certain kind of psychological impact on people who have no idea why they've been swept off the street and put into this cell, and now they haven't seen another human for 24 or 48 hours.
Well, Tracy Siska, who I suppose in some ways may be the John Conroy of this generation, who's written about this extensively, prepared a list of 12 questions, I believe, for the Chicago Police Department that he thought would clear the air. Let's just, let's ask these questions and have them answer them. And I think it's reasonable to say to those who would criticize us for even talking about this that that's our job, is to ask questions. And so far, the police department appears not to be too ready to answer these basic questions. We've got a few seconds left.
Well,
what do you want to say?
Well, I think that you need to look at the operational aspects of it. We're talking about, are we going back to the Red Squad type of techniques? Are we going back to disruption like COINTELPRO? Because those kinds of tactics seem to be what's in place there. And of course, we see all of the new forms of surveillance that the police department has as well. How does that all fit together?
Okay. And at that point, we have to stop. Thank you for your service, Flint Taylor.
Well, thank you for having
Chicago
me.
thanks you for what you've done. Thank you for your service too, Steve.
Thank you.
Steve Rhodes from the Beachwood Reporter. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. You can watch us anytime, and you can watch us right here at any time you want just by going to that address, and you can download us or watch us. You can podcast us too. I'm Ken Davis. We'll see you next week with another show here on CAN TV. Thanks very much for watching. Bye.